And without further ado, I would like to go ahead and just introduce our speakers. We have Sam Mazzeo and Olivia Phillips of A Better Corporation, or Better for short. They both have extensive experience in assisting clients setting up their business entities, labor and employment law, contracts, copyright, and so much more. Olivia and Sam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, so we'll kind of jump right into some introductions. Liv, if you want to do the introduction, sorry I didn't give you a heads up before that. I wanted to do that.
Let me clear my throat then. Well, I'm Liv, and as Carolyn mentioned, I work with Sam at A Better Professional Corporation. Sam and I both handle different kinds of practice areas. We overlap on a few of them, but mainly I handle labor and employment, contracts, a little bit of copyright here and there. And as you can see from my bio, I'm a dog mom. That's my dog. That's right above Sam's head. And so any of your questions about dog-related etiquette, I can also help with.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you can see, Sam, I'm thinking about Louie, Liv's dog. And I usually practice within our firm on things like trademark, business formation, which we'll talk a lot about today, contracts. As you can see there in my little blurb on my bio, I can also teach you how to do a standing backflip. Definitely anything Halloween related, I got you. And I am not a big fan of birds, but we don't have to go there today. So let's jump right into the topic. So today the topic is going to be the different types of business entities that are available to you to operate your business. And this is a little bit of a confusing kind of way to frame this. I'll get into that in a second. But first, we have to do our lawyerly due diligence here and give you this legal disclaimer. I am definitely not going to read this whole thing, but the crux of this is that anything that we outline here today and anything that we talk about is not legal advice. Please don't go out and act on it. You should consult an attorney before you do so. Everything that we're providing is informational and it's as is. It's not specific to your situation. So with that fun stuff out of the way, we will jump right into the basic entity types. And again, I mentioned that this can get a little bit confusing when we're talking about the types of ways to operate your business, because the first two on this list are not actual business entity types. They are ways you can do business without an entity. And so what I'm talking about here is the sole proprietorship and the general partnership. Now, the sole proprietorship, I'll get into these in a second, but again, sole proprietor and general partnership are really just informal and they're not entities. The entities are going to be the C corporation and the limited liability company. Now, there's also a bunch of variations of these different types of ways to do business, and that's another reason why it can be super confusing. And so some of those can be limited partnerships rather than a general partnership. You can have professional corporations instead of a standard C corporation. You can have non-stock mutual benefit corporations, which are the type of corporation that a nonprofit uses. And then you can have things like a series LLC, a series limited liability company. That's really designed for kind of like it sounds, a series where there's several LLCs that are part of a single project. So that's some of the other types of these. And I like to mention those just because when we talk to clients and people get confused, it's because there's all this different terminology for a lot of the times the same thing. So moving into the sole proprietorship. So you don't have to file anything with the state to create a sole proprietorship. That doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have to file anything at all to do business as a sole proprietor. What you do need to do is usually file for a business license in your local city or county. Some places don't require it, which is why I say you may need to do that. I would recommend that you get an EIN, which is your employer identification number from the IRS. The reason that I'd recommend that for a sole proprietor is that if you don't, you'd be using your social security number. And if you're using your social security number on things like your business license application and maybe your contracts with other people, your W-9 so people can pay you, then you're giving everyone your social security number. Not the best idea. And then you most likely would also need a DBA, a doing business as. A lot of places call this a fictitious business name, same thing. And essentially what you can think of that as is like a nickname. So, my name's Samuel, but I go by Sam. If you are going to call your business something other than your name and you're a sole proprietor, that would be your nickname and it would be your DBA. So, if we were doing business as Better and we didn't have a corporation in place, we would need a DBA for that name Better to do business under it. And then you can see here, if you're selling any tangible goods, which is an important distinction, doesn't mean digital goods or anything like that. Tangible goods, you'll also need a seller's permit in your state. So that's the sole proprietor. That's one person. Don't file anything with the state to have that. Now we move to a general partnership, which is two people. And again, though, an informal type of way to do business. You don't need to file with the state to have a partnership. You can, you don't need to. And with this one, just like with a sole proprietorship, you do not have personal liability protection. I didn't touch on that with the sole proprietor, but it's super, super important because as a sole proprietor doing business solo or as a general partnership, you and one other, maybe more people, you do not have liability protection for all of your personal assets. So, my Bernie cardboard cutout back there, if someone sued me, that could be part of what they recover. They wouldn't take that. They would recover it and sell it, and then they would have the money. But in a situation where you're sued, all of your personal assets, bank accounts, car, home, can be subject to the liability of the work you're doing if you're a sole proprietor or a general partnership. Now, with this one, again, business license, you'll need that. You can think of your business license almost like a driver's license. You can go out and do business, certainly, without any of the stuff that we're going to tell you in this presentation today. But if you get caught, you're going to get in trouble. And the business license is essentially like your driver's license. You can go out and do business, but if you get caught without it, just like if you're driving without a license, you're going to get in some trouble. And again, if you're selling any goods, you'll need a seller's permit. And then again, as well, EIN, so you're not using social security numbers, and you'll need a DBA if you're not going to go by your actual names. And so, you can see down there, you would need a partnership agreement for this one. So that's one thing in addition that you wouldn't see with a sole proprietorship, because with a sole proprietorship, you don't need an agreement with yourself. So as a general partnership, you do want an agreement with your other partners that sets out things like who can do what, who's in charge of what, how you're going to pay each other, who owns intellectual property, who's in charge of taxes, all of these things that you don't want to think about, but you have to. And that would be the type of thing that goes into your partnership agreement. So we've covered sole proprietorship and general partnerships, which is a good framework to go into corporations. So corporations are like the OG business entity. These have been around for decades and decades and decades. Before that, this is a little fun fact for you. Before that, companies actually put everything into a trust, and that's how they ran. And that's why you hear of antitrust laws, because back in the day, everything was done through a trust. And so there was no such thing as a corporation. Eventually, a corporation was created. Corporations do require that you file with the state. You would actually file articles of incorporation, sometimes a certificate of incorporation. In California, it's articles of incorporation. And then that actually gives you the authority to operate your business through this corporation, which gives you that personal liability protection. Any of the owners, including the staff, even if they're not owners, anybody doing work on behalf of the business, for the business, when it's a corporation, will have personal liability protection. There's some exceptions. If you did something that's grossly negligent or fraudulent or something like that, typically falls outside of that liability protection. And the reason I keep sort of touching on this liability protection is it's the big distinction between sole proprietor, general partnership, and then corporations and LLCs. And in the law, everything is a trade-off. So what you're looking at here is you'll have to file paperwork with the state. You're going to have different taxes now that you have to pay that you wouldn't have with your sole proprietor or your general partnership. And those are the types of things that you trade off to get that personal liability protection. And with regard to those taxes, the big one to mention here in California, this will be both applicable to corporations and LLCs, is called the California Minimum Franchise Tax. It is a minimum of $800 a year, and it actually goes up based on your revenue. So something to keep in mind there. Now, back to the corporation. So you get that personal liability protection. That's awesome. You still need to get a business license. Unfortunately, it doesn't do away with that requirement. You still need a seller's permit if you're going to sell goods. And you do not need a DBA if you'll be doing business under whatever the name of the corporation is. So for instance, a Better Professional Corporation we do business as better. If we always wanted to say that mouthful, a better professional corporation, hey Louie, I see your dog in the background, Liv. If every time we were going to say our company name, we had to say a better professional corporation, we wouldn't need a DBA. But we went out and got DBAs for better APC, better legal, sometimes people call us. And so that's just because we're lawyers and we dot the I's and cross the T's. But if our business was just called better, we would not need a DBA. We would just call it better. We, unfortunately, as attorneys, are required to have a professional corporation, so we can't just be called better. And that's why we got the DBAs. And then with a corporation, you'll want an EIN. That's, again, going to be like the social security number for the company so that you can use that number rather than your actual social or anything like that. That's also really helpful if you're going to have people on payroll, which is another thing that a corporation really helps to facilitate, is paying people salaries and things like that on payroll. Now, I'll touch on this a little bit later, but I want to sort of plant the seed. Corporate formalities are a very, very important thing that applies to both corporations and also to LLCs. They're things like having your filings done, paying your taxes, the business license, seller's permit, having that EIN, and then it'll also include things like your shareholder agreement or your bylaws. And that's what I touch on here. I do want to mention something really quick that's mentioned on the previous slide about the Delaware C Corp. I've found over the years that by and large, everyone just sort of assumes that the Delaware C Corp is the way to form a corporation. Sometimes you'll hear Delaware S Corp. I'll get to S Corp in a minute as well. But when people say, Delaware C Corp, that's the way to go, that's sort of this traditional kind of school of thought that we don't particularly subscribe to. And the reason for that is that wherever your corporation starts out, wherever you file those articles of incorporation, that's its home jurisdiction. But if you are in another place, which I'm of the mindset, I know this isn't true, but I like to say that I don't think anybody lives in Delaware because it's just where we file paperwork. But none of our clients that have Delaware corporations live in Delaware. And so all of the things that you hear, this Delaware C Corp myth, that are so beneficial to be in Delaware don't actually apply if you don't live in Delaware also. And in fact, you have to pay extra to have an address in Delaware to do that and have your corporation there. And then ultimately, if you're in California, like most of the people likely are on this, you then have to register in California. So now you're registered in 2 states. You've got 2 states to worry about annual requirements and all the filings and upkeep, and it's just more things to forget. Now, there are scenarios where Delaware makes sense, usually investment, probably not terribly relevant for everyone on the audience today. So going back to this next slide here, shareholders and boards of directors. Now, those are the inherent built-in structure of a corporation. And the way that this sort of works, it can get kind of confusing. And I don't typically recommend corporations for 1 or 2 people because of this structure. So at the top of corporations, you have shareholders. Those are the owners, and they own shares in the corporation that equate to a percentage of the corporation's ownership. So shareholders at the top, they appoint the board of directors, and then the board of directors is a body that votes on most of the high-level stuff for the company, taking out loans, hiring and firing people, things like that. And then they instruct the officers to carry out the decisions that the board has made. Now, like I was saying, I don't typically recommend a corporation 1, 2 people owners because they're going to be the shareholders and the board and the officers. And then you'll have to hold shareholder meetings with yourself. And then you'll hold a board meeting with yourself. And then you'll tell yourself what to do from that board meeting vote. Doesn't make the most sense. However, corporations are the best entity, now that we're talking about entities, for investment. And so that's when I typically would recommend a corporation. And the important other thing to mention here is that with corporations, you have separate tax filings. As a sole proprietor and as a partnership, you typically will just report your taxes on your personal tax returns rather than a separate tax return. Corporations, it is a separate tax return. I believe it's a K-1. And so that's a difference as well here. And like I mentioned, this structure is a little bit unwieldy for only a couple of people. And so that's why I typically actually recommend limited liability companies. Now, this is a newer type of business entity, meaning that it's like 40 years old instead of 80 or something like that. And the funny thing about that, which is kind of a hassle sometimes, is that sometimes there are still some reluctance from companies and investors and people to work with LLCs because of the fact that it's new. And that's silly. You can also do investment through LLCs. I was saying corporations are better, but we've done for our clients over the years probably close to $1 million of investment through LLCs. So it's not that you can't do that. It's just a little bit less conducive to investment than a corporation would be. But with an LLC, because again, now we're talking entities, not like the sole prop and the general partnership, you do have personal liability protection if you observe your corporate formalities. We'll get to that. And then this is another one, still need to file a business license, still need a seller's permit, most likely don't need that DBA. Again, same deal. If you go by the name of your LLC publicly for your brand, don't need a DBA. And then you should get an EIN, again, so you're not using your social. And so you can see here, there's a through line through all of these. No matter what you are doing, get your business license. And no matter what structure you are, get your business license. And no matter any of this, if you're selling goods, get your seller's permit. That is true of all of these, no matter what. And if you don't do those things, you'll probably end up paying more money later because they'll eventually find out. And the way they find out is all of these things are payments in some way, shape, or form to a government office. And that's how they make their money. So they'll find out sooner or later and they'll want that money. So moving into some of the more specifics on the LLC. So again, we talked about shareholders and boards for corporations, no such structure in an LLC. And I get people all the time that come to me and they say, yeah, for the board of directors for my LLC. That's not a thing. And the reason that it's important to make that distinction is that your board of directors for your corporation has fiduciary duties. They have legal obligations. And so those fiduciary duties mean they have to be loyal to the company. They have to make decisions in the best interest of the company, things like that. And those are legally binding duties that as a board member, you owe to that corporation. LLCs, no such thing. And so you can have an informal board committee type thing, but they don't owe those same legal duties to the LLC. Very important to mention that. And then with an LLC, you have your members, they're the owners. So corporation, they're shareholders. LLC, they're called members. And the reason for that is that you have membership interest in an LLC like you have shares in a corporation. Just, terminology that makes all this stuff more confusing, of course. And so members, they're the owners, and they can also be the managers. So there's none of this sort of tiered structure of decision-making like you have with a corporation. It's much more simple. And the members, usually the managers, make all the decisions. They don't have to hold board meetings. They don't have to hold any meetings by law. Whereas corporation, one shareholder meeting a year, one board meeting a year required by law. Not the case with LLCs. So you can be the member and the manager, and you don't have to hold regular meetings. The important thing here, though, again with taxes, is that you're treated just like a sole proprietor for taxes, not for legal liability. And this is a really important thing that I'll cover in a second, but your business entity typically will have a different tax status than what it's called. And I know that's super confusing, and it always is, but you can think of it as you get your business entity, that LLC or corporation, from the state, and then you get your tax treatment from the IRS. And so LLCs are typically considered disregarded if it's a single owner. And so you just pay taxes on your personal tax return like a sole proprietor. And then if there's more than one person as members, the owners of your LLC, it's treated as a partnership for taxes. And so out of everything I've covered so far, the only one that has a separate tax status is a corporation. Everything else, personal taxes. Now, again, you can see down there in the notes, much simpler here, membership interest rather than shares. And I'm not going to cover the confusing ownership structure of corporations, so don't mind me. I'm going to skip to the next slide. So now we'll get to this S-Corp election. So anytime you hear someone say, I have an S-Corp, that's not a type of business entity. So, going back, LLCs, corporations, there are others, like I mentioned, benefit corporations, professional corporations like we have. And those types of business entities, again, are given to you by the state. You file something, the state gives you the authority for those. An S Corp is not any of those things. It is a tax election. It's a tax treatment. The example that I have always given that is exceedingly silly, and the more years I'm doing this that I tell this example, it seems even sillier, but I'm going to say it anyway. So if you think about the LLC and the corporation that I talked about as like chocolate and vanilla ice cream, and you put sprinkles on your chocolate and vanilla ice cream, it doesn't change the ice cream, right? You're still chocolate vanilla ice cream. It didn't change the flavor. It just made it taste better because of the sprinkles. The S Corp election is the sprinkles for taxes. It just makes your LLC or your corporation a different tax treatment. And so for corporations, it's not as impactful, but as an LLC, you actually then go from your normal just reporting your taxes on your personal taxes as even if you have more than one owner, to then having a corporate tax return, and you would have a separate tax filing. So the S Corp election, again, not a business entity, only a tax election. You have to file it within a few months after you create your business, and you can do that every year. And then it's typically the most helpful for a single owner LLC. And usually there's a revenue threshold that makes it worthwhile. That's a CPA question. We always say that if conversation 1A about your business is with us, 1B should be with that CPA so that they can advise on whether or not the tax structure that we've outlined works, because it's always easier to fit the legal to the tax rather than fit the tax to the legal. So again, S Corp election, it's not sprinkles, but it's also not a business entity itself. All right, corporate formalities. These are important. It's just a silly formal thing that the law likes to call all of these things you see here. And this is not an exhaustive list here. There are other things that might get factored in, but really what you want to think about for the corporate formalities is keeping your business separate from you personally. And the reason for that is that personal liability protection that I mentioned, the law calls that the corporate veil. And if you want to pierce the corporate veil and hold someone personally liable, one of the ways that you would do that is to allege that they haven't been following their corporate formalities, meaning that they don't keep their bank account separate from their personal bank account, so the business and personal separate. Don't file your taxes, don't file with the state, you're delinquent on that type of stuff. Don't pay personal stuff with the company accounts, don't pay the company accounts with personal. Make sure that your internal paperwork is in place. So I'd mentioned for corporations, your bylaws and your shareholder agreement, making sure those are in place and they're signed. There's a lot of people that have those but don't have them signed. They don't mean anything unless they're signed. Make sure they're signed. And then with an LLC, it's your operating agreement. And so that internal paperwork is another one of these corporate formalities that are very important to have. And then this one's a really weird one that sometimes people don't realize, which is make sure that whenever you sign anything on behalf of your business, you list your title with your business, whether it's president or CEO or whatever it is, treasurer or secretary. Make sure you sign with that, because if you don't, it could then be challenged later and said to be that you signed it personally and that you're personally liable, which if you have a corporation in place and you're observing all these corporate formalities, to then have that undone just because you didn't list your title would be a pretty big bummer. And in fact, depending on where you fall politically, Trump has gotten sued several times for not listing his title when he has signed stuff, and they're trying to hold him personally liable for like those steaks that he sold or something. So a very prominent example of when you don't list your title, you could potentially be held personally liable. And then wanted to touch on some that I've mentioned sort of throughout this so far, but other types of entities. And again, remember, entities are the formal things that you file with the state for, not a sole proprietor, not a general partnership. And one of the ones that we work with a lot, because we work with a lot of social causes and social companies, is benefit corporations. Now, there's an important distinction there, because there is such thing as a benefit corporation. That's just like the corporation we've been talking about, the LLC. You file with the state to have a benefit corporation. But there's a B Corp certification also, which is offered by a nonprofit organization called the B Lab. And you have to take it's a lot of questions. Liv's been working on it. It's like over 100 questions. and you have to get a certain score. And if you pass that assessment, you can then be a certified B Corp from that nonprofit. And then you'll get that little badge that everyone sees on the B Corp websites like Patagonia. Professional corporations. So if anybody in the audience today is a licensed professional state, and that's pretty much everything. I mean, we're talking lawyers like us, dentists, doctors, CPAs. If you're a barber or a hairdresser, they're licensed by the state. If you're a therapist, all of those things, since they're licensed by the state, are required to have a professional corporation or an LLP, which means that for those licensed positions, you can't have an LLC and you can't have a standard corporation. If you want to go with a similar to LLC route, it's the LLP. And if you want to have a corporation, it's the professional corporation. Then there are other types of LLCs out there. Series LLC, I kind of mentioned that earlier. Single purpose LLCs, sometimes called SPEs, single purpose entities. Those are things that you might want to put real estate in to hold real estate, hold a film project perhaps, and it's just designed to hold that thing. It doesn't do anything else. It doesn't provide services. One example here is, like I said, a film. If you just have the film project in the LLC and maybe you sell the film in the LLC altogether someday, perfect for a single purpose LLC. Now, if you're a production company and you're producing a film and you're also providing production services as a vendor, that's not a single purpose LLC, different kind of scenario. And then, as I had mentioned before, non-stock mutual benefit corporations or public benefit corporations, that's the other one. Those are the underlying corporation for a nonprofit organization. And you can see there the non-stock. So I mentioned back with corporations, you have shares and shareholders are the owners. With a non-stock mutual benefit corporation, no stock, because there's no owners of a nonprofit organization. The board, that board of directors, is the highest level, and they're the ones that steward the organization. No one holds any stock in a nonprofit because no one owns it. And then we'll move here into my last slide, which is when should you form an entity, or why should you form an entity? I guess the why is pretty easy, to protect your personal assets. But when, this is a question that we get really often, and it's a hard question for us to answer. As attorneys, if we're wearing our lawyer hats, we're going to say get it because it protects you, and that's our job. We as your lawyer are here to make sure that you're protected and to help you do everything you can to ensure that you personally won't be liable, and generally speaking, that your business won't be held liable for any type of damages or injuries. And so the answer you're always going to get from us is you should have it regardless if you're doing any type of business out there. Now, practically speaking, it's got to be, the juice has to be worth the squeeze. And there's a lot of fees and filings and things that you have to do to put an entity together. And so it is a question of, is the money there? And do the taxes make sense? Because sometimes if you look, and like I said, conversation 1B should be with a CPA, because if you look at it and you put together, here's all the costs to put together the LLC, here's the tax savings that I might get for my LLC or corporation, they might be a wash, or you might even come out on top due to the tax advantages of having a business entity. And so it's not just that sort of cost benefit analysis of this is how much it costs to form the entity. It's also, what advantages do I get for taxes? What type of savings might I have because of payroll? It's easier to withhold taxes then than pay them quarterly, perhaps. And then how risky is it what you're doing? Because if you're, let's say, doing an axe throwing rink, like that's pretty risky probably. And so you definitely want that personal liability protection to protect yourself. If, on the other hand, you are, it's hard sometimes to think of something that's not risky because we're lawyers. But, if you're selling stickers, someone could still swallow one of those, I guess, and you could get sued. But
paper cuts.
Yeah, paper cuts. That's a good point. So I hopefully no one sues over paper cuts, but America's relatively litigious. So how risky, whatever it is you're doing, how early it is, the larger your customer base, the larger your audience, the more risk there might be. And so, as you move forward, it's almost like that whole idea of, a snowball going downhill and it gathering more snow. It's the further you get into your business and the more people you have that buy from you or watch, the more products you sell, the more services you provide, the higher dollar amounts your contracts might be, the higher the risk level is, just like that snowball going down the hill. So as you sort of look at these things, that's another consideration. And then, is it a temporary thing? Are you just doing a one-off project? Because then maybe it's not worth spending the money to put together something that you have to undo. Because that's another thing that with business entities like an LLC or a corporation, you have to dissolve them if you stop doing business. And if you don't, you're probably going to owe a bunch of fines and penalties. We have people that come to us sometimes and say, oh, yeah, I stopped doing business with that business like 5 years ago. And then we look up the LLC that they had, and it's been delinquent for 3 years, and they owe a couple grand because they didn't pay their taxes, they didn't file those things, they didn't stay up on the minimum franchise tax, they didn't observe their corporate formalities. And so really important decision whether or not to move forward with an entity because of all of what it takes to set it up, dealing with the taxes, and what it takes to undo it and dissolve it later. And so it's a very loaded question as to when you should form your LLC or corporation. But I hope that this helps to give you at least a functional rubric on what the considerations might be. And then, of course, as you can see on this slide, we offer free consultations. And so you can send us an email there, you can hit us up on social, and we're certainly happy to talk this out with you. As we've mentioned sort of before in the legal disclaimer, we can't give you kind of legal advice. We'll try to answer any questions that came through. But we certainly offer free consultations, and we usually can help people pretty comprehensively conversations. And then if not, of course, we're here to actually legal services and help you out. So I think what I'll do, I'll stop sharing now.
Yeah, we had a few questions come through.
Yeah, so
let's answer Hannah's first, since that is kind of directly what we were just talking about, and then we'll jump into the second one that we have. So Hannah's was, do these corporate formalities apply to sole proprietorships and general partnerships too?
It's a great question, and sorry I didn't cover that. Those do not apply to your general partnerships and your sole proprietorships. And the reason for that, hopefully this makes sense with how I've laid things out, is that you don't have that personal liability protection as a sole proprietor or as a general partnership. And those corporate formalities are specifically and only really there to protect your personal assets when you're doing business. So not an applicable concept to the sole prop and the general partnership.
And then the second question, a couple more coming in. I'm going to kind of go in order of when they came in. So sure. The next one is a two-parter. I'll handle the first part. You can jump in on the second one, Sam. If I'm a designer and I need to pay my collaborator, say a freelance copywriter, would this need to be on payroll? That's a great question. I'm going to jump in here just because I do handle labor and employment. It is going to depend on a couple of things. First, we're going to need to know, where is that person located? Because if they're in California, we're going to be basing our answers off of California law. If they're elsewhere, it's going to be based on the law where they are. So to kind of back up, when you're working with somebody, it's not about where you, the person hiring, is located. It's where the person being hired is located. That's the law that we look at. And so if the person you are hiring is in California, we're going to need to know a little bit more about what you do, what the collaborator is going to do. Here are the examples: freelance copywriter for a designer. And the reason for this is because this could either be a contractor or it could be an employee. If it's an employee, then yeah, you'd run it through payroll. And if it's a contractor, you're not going to run it through the same system that you would necessarily run employees through. But that being said, some payroll administrators handle both employees and contractors. They just put them through separate funnels, let's say. So it could technically be through the same website, same payroll provider, but it's going to be two different systems, if that makes sense. And so second half of that question was, do I need to have a corporation in order to do so? So I think that could be either hiring or using payroll.
Yeah, and so and that is where it can get a little bit confusing too, because certainly if you have a corporation or you have an LLC, it is going to be easier typically to run payroll and have payroll set up. And you certainly don't need payroll for a contractor, like Olivia said. And the distinction too, that we sometimes run into with clients that I had a long conversation with a client yesterday about is that there's also different ways to pay yourself once you have a business entity in place, because if you set up payroll, you can pay yourself a salary, which is different than if you pay yourself a profit distribution or a dividend from the company. And they have very different implications. And they also have different tax, what's the word I'm looking for? Tax thresholds, tax liabilities, tax rates. They have different tax rates. So when you pay yourself a capital distribution or a profit distribution, that's going to have a different tax rate than what your payroll is. And your payroll automatically withholds it, remember, when you pay a salary or you pay wages. So you don't need a corporation to do that. It just usually is easier to do it through a corporation or an LLC.
All right, next question. Can an LLC be owned by a group? And what do you need? Oh, sorry, it just bounced because
Sorry, I pressed done.
it's okay. Can an LLC be owned by a group? And what do you need to know? Can there be multiple equal owners in an LLC? What does that mean? Are you an employee of your own LLC? So a lot of questions.
They're good though. It's a good segue into what I was just talking about. So absolutely, you can own an LLC can be owned by a group, and essentially what that would be a multi-owner LLC, like I had mentioned at one point during the slides. You can have hundreds of owners if you wanted to. For instance, if you think about big companies, this is a corporation example, but it's the same. Like Google has probably thousands of shareholders, and those are all owners. And an LLC is similar. You can have many, many owners. Now, the tough thing with an LLC is that you have 100% ownership. And so when you ask if there can be multiple equal owners, yes, but you have to figure out that ratio of that math with the 100%. You could have 10% owners. You could have, 20% owners. And if any of this math is wrong, I always tell people I went to law school, not math school, so don't quote me on this, but you get the idea. You could have 101% owners. And so that is all doable in an LLC. And then as far as are you an employee of your own LLC, that's the segue from what I was talking about a second ago, because you can be an employee and an owner, and you can pay yourself multiple ways in that scenario. So to give you an example, we have a corporation, but a lot of this stuff still applies to LLCs. But with our corporation, I pay myself every pay cycle, and Liv as well. We get some profit distribution and a salary. So we do both. And typically there's a whole tax sort of strategy that you would want to sort of implement for that. And when you pay yourself profit distributions or dividends, an important thing to remember is that in a scenario where we have multiple owners, it has to be equal to whatever their ownership percentages are. So if you have, 101% owners and one person wants to take $10, well, every other one of those 1% owners also has to get $10. And so that's something that you have to consider when you're paying yourself profit dividends or distributions that isn't the same when you pay yourself as an employee, a salary or wages. That can be totally different than the other people that are owners and getting wages.
How long does it take to set up an LLC?
That's an easy one. So if it's around the beginning of the year, a long time. Our government offices get very, very backed up around end of year, beginning of year. However, typically in California, they have an online filing system now. Thankfully, that was only in like the last year. And it usually only takes about 3 to 4 business days for them to process the paperwork to form your LLC, to give you the authority to operate as an LLC. But there are other steps, some of which we covered. So, 3 to 4 business days to get it officially on the books. We'll give you your EIN at that point. And then also we'll start working on your operating agreement for your LLC. And then that just takes as long as, it takes us to draft it and for you to go through it and us to revise it and you to sign it. And then we'll file your business license application, maybe your seller's permit application. And then we do a 90-day statement of information, 90 days after the formation date. But all that to say, for you to be official with your LLC, with the state, 3 to 4 business days.
If I already have a general partnership and an EIN, and then I decide to get fancy with a corporation, do I need a new EIN?
You would need a new EIN in that scenario. If you decided to have an LLC and it was the same partners as your partnership, you actually would not need a new EIN because, going back to what I said, an LLC with multiple owners is treated as a partnership for taxes, and your EIN comes from the IRS, who handles taxes. So in that scenario where you go to an LLC and you maintain the same partners, you don't need a new EIN. But because remember, a corporation is its own tax status, unlike the rest. If you went to a corporation, you would need to get a new EIN, unfortunately.
All right. For an individual that does not have an address required to start an LLC, do you recommend a virtual office? If so, do you have a recommendation for a virtual office company / service?
Yeah, so this one's actually kind of a tough one that we deal with because the Secretary of State doesn't like PO boxes for the address, which includes virtual office addresses. And so it's kind of tough because what we actually see a lot of is that people will still get a virtual office or a PO box and just call it a suite number. And at the end of the day, like, we're not here telling you to ignore what the Secretary of State requires and that you go get a virtual office or a PO box, and then we frame it that way for the Secretary of State. But we do see that often. And at the end of the day, so long as you can receive mail there, that's the most important thing. And so, a virtual office, PO box type of thing is a good option if you're able to use a physical address, but then use your virtual office or PO box as your mailing address, better. And as far as a recommendation goes, not really. I personally used one previously that was called iPostal, I believe, and it was awful. So that's not a recommendation for that one. But I think some of the best options are just to maybe try to get an address at like a local co-working space if they offer just like a mail service or something like that. But a normal PO box would also work. A lot of them nowadays, because of COVID, I think also will scan and email you all the mail that comes in. That's what I would look for if it were me.
The next, anonymous attendee gave you a compliment. Such a great presentation.
Thank you.
Recently, I was working as a freelancer in animation and had a CPA file taxes for me for the past couple of years. Recently, I was charged penalty from Department of Finance in California. What's the best way to avoid this in the future as a freelancer?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's probably that franchise tax board for the minimum franchise tax that you're referencing there. And yeah, I mean, it's hard. I think the most important thing that you can do to avoid those types of penalties, especially when they're tax related, is to get with that CPA early each year and start to plan out what you think your revenue is going to be that year, which, trust me, I totally understand as creatives and as artists, it's really, really hard to know what your income is going to look like and what your work is going to look like for the year. And a lot of the time that can be true for us too as a service-based business. We don't really know what the market's going to look like. And so it's hard. And, I guess if there's any silver lining to if you were to work with your CPA early in the year and just estimate what your income would be and then pay quarterly taxes on that, which this is the recommendation, is to get with them and just pay quarterly. That's what we do for our business. And you can pay quarterly on that franchise tax as well. And the worst case scenario there is that you overpay. But if you overpay, you get a tax refund. So it's not the worst thing, but obviously that's still money that comes out of your bank account throughout the year that then you have to wait to get back the following year. But at least you would avoid any penalties and fines in that scenario.
If you are a multidisciplinary artist, does it ever make sense to divide your services into different entities if they both become profitable enough? For instance, voiceover and copywriting / editing.
It certainly could. The thing that you end up facing in those questions and those scenarios is that then you start to get into a situation of how many filing fees and how many franchise taxes, like we were just talking about, and how many different tax filings and things like that, and all of the corporate formalities that you have to observe for all of the entities that you might put into place. But it can make sense sometimes because, I don't know, let's say for the voiceover, somebody wants to buy all of the voiceovers that you ever did ever to make a archival set of voiceovers because they're general enough to apply to all kinds of stuff into the future. Well, you might be able to just sell that LLC or corporation to them outright, and they get all of that, and then you don't affect your copywriting and editing services. In this scenario, the two aren't sort of dramatically different in risk profile. Voiceover, copywriting, editing, all of that is sort of in the same kind of risk of creative services. And so I wouldn't say that the risk level here necessitates multiple entities. So it could be if it's something that you feel like it's very separate, maybe one of them might get sold someday, or the common reason to have multiple entities is maybe you have different partners. If you have a couple partners for the voiceover that are different than the partners for the copywriting and editing, then it would make sense to have multiple entities, because if you have all of the partners in one, but they only some of them participate in some of the services, they're all getting profit from everything. So that would make sense to break it out into their own things. And then investment, sometimes it makes sense if you're going to have different investors for different projects, you might have different entities.
If you're in a general partnership, is all of your income considered your personal income, or is it only what you actually pay yourself?
So we're getting into CPA territory a little bit here, but my understanding, and I believe a CPA would confirm this, is that yes, all of the money that comes into that general partnership is considered personal income for the partners. And this is similar to an LLC, because an LLC is treated as a partnership. And so even with an LLC, all of the money that comes into the LLC is going to show up on the LLC members, the owners, personal tax returns. Even if you left a bunch of money in the company bank account and didn't pay yourself, that money that sits in the company bank account is still money that you're taxed on your personal return, because of the fact that it's a partnership, which is actually different than a corporation. A corporation is usually taxed when the money comes in and when you pay yourself. So it's a way different scenario. So that's a long, confusing way of saying that, yes, when you're a general partnership, it will be on your personal return, and it's not just what you pay yourself.
Okay. Do you need to decide on S Corp status when forming your LLC?
So there's, I believe it's a 2-month and 15-day period of time that you can file your S Corp election with the IRS. It may actually be 3 months and 15 days, something along those lines, because I think we just filed one for a client before the 15th of March. And so it is that window of time that you have to make that decision. And the sooner the better, of course, because then you're not up against that deadline. However, with S Corp elections, that period of time, whether it's 2 months and 15 days or 3 months and 15 days, and I'm pretty sure it's the 3 months and 15, that actually is the same period every year. So usually before March 15th, you have to file that S Corp election. But if you didn't do it your first year, and then you work through your taxes with your CPA, and they're like, man, you would have really benefited from an S Corp election. If you're going to have the same revenue next year, we should do it. You would do that before March 15th of the following year.
Can I, a U.S. citizen, as an LLC, apply for a visa for an employee, a foreigner?
Yes, this is a very involved question, and we don't do visa work. And Liv, you might even be able to add to some of this. But essentially, my understanding of that is that it's a whole thing, because you have to sponsor that worker in the U.S. And it's not just a sort of like, you file this and then they get it and it's all done. It's sort of like an ongoing thing for a period of years.
Yeah, and it would also depend on what the worker is doing, because you can't just do that for any type of employee. Unfortunately, there are several different types of visas. It's A through U, I want to say, in the alphabet, and there are several subcategories that fall under that, and they all have different kind of like nicknames. There is the artist visa, but the artist visa is specifically for artists that are like of extreme ability, is how it's described. So unfortunately, if you were, let's say, a high school art teacher, you're probably not going to fall under the artist visa. And so there's a lot that goes into that, and that's why you definitely do want to speak to an attorney who specializes in employment related visas if this is something that you would be considering, because they're going to be able to Sherpa you through that really complex process a little bit better than if you try to do it yourself. Actually, a lot better, sorry. All right, next question. I am a fine art conservator and my job carries significant risk. Yeah, I'd say so. At the moment, I'm a single member LLC. My business is continuing to grow. So would the conversation about LLC versus corporation happen with my CPA, or should I speak to an attorney first?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it sounds like you already have an LLC in place. And so I would probably say speaking to a CPA about what's the most advantageous for taxes would maybe be the first step. But remember that with an LLC or a corporation, you actually have virtually the same personal liability protection because they're both formal business entities. So whether it's an LLC or a corporation, so long as you're observing your corporate formalities, you should have that liability protection that you're looking for, regardless of the level of risk. The whole idea is that as long as you have your business entity, you observe your corporate formalities, you are protected. And so I don't know, if the gist of the question is, is a corporation going to be more protective than an LLC? I don't necessarily think that's the case. And you should have a liability protection with both the LLC or the corporation, but you might have more favorable tax treatment with a corporation. And not to get too confusing, but you can actually elect to have your LLC treated as a C Corp or an S Corp, and then it would have the exact same treatment as a normal corporation, which is typically just treated as a C Corp for taxes.
Wild. All right. Just saying what everybody's thinking. Do California educators who have credentials from the state need to register as an LLP, i.e. teaching voice lessons, but also hold the credential?
That's a good question. We actually haven't dealt with licensed educators in the past, and this is a relatively I guess debated topic in California as to which licensed professionals need to have these LLPs or professional corporations, because when you think about it, barbers and hairstylists are licensed by the state. And we did a really deep research project about this a few years ago when we started working with a bunch of local salons. And by and large, most barbers and hair salons are not registered as professional corporations or LLPs, but the way the statute reads, they should be. And so I would just go with the default here of yes, you should because you're licensed by the state and that's how the statute reads. Now, I would definitely encourage you to follow up with us and we can do some more research and actually get you a very specific answer. But my guess would be yes. Now, this also relates to sort of why you would need to have that in place. Like if you're just being contracted out by schools or colleges, you might not need an entity at all because you should then be protected under their entity and their insurance. But if you're providing voice lessons just as your services, and then you would most likely need an entity. And I would say that without doing further research, it should be an LLP or a professional corporation.
Is it common for actors who don't have representation to create an LLC? Does having representation eliminate the need for an LLC?
So I'd actually say that having representation has no bearing on whether or not you should have an LLC. I can see where that question would arise, but with representation, they're typically, and with our clients that have talent agencies, they're really just there to kind of be that middleman. And yes, certainly they negotiate some of your contracts for you. They might even sign them if you give them power of attorney to do so. But at the end of the day, that LLC is going to protect you. And we do have several clients that are actors or artists in one capacity or another, and they have their own entities. And sometimes it's multiple entities to that question earlier because maybe they do all of the acting through one. Maybe they do other creative services through another. Maybe they have products through another. But the overarching answer that I would give here is that representation actually doesn't really have any bearing on whether or not you should have an entity in place because most likely, if it's like the scenarios that I've seen before, that agent or your representative or your manager, they're just a contractual vendor to you and they don't actually impact your liability one way or the other.
Do you have to be a U.S. citizen to file/own an LLC?
You do not. You don't have to be a U.S. citizen to be an owner in a LLC or a corporation. I'll leave it at that.
If one person started the LLC, can a second partner join later?
Yes. So you can add and remove partners of an LLC or a corporation at any time throughout the lifespan of the LLC or the corporation. That's an oversimplification, however, because in order to remove a partner, you have to buy them out or they have to resign and surrender their ownership. And typically they'll pay taxes on the buyout or the surrender of their ownership. And that's true of both an LLC and a corporation when someone leaves. to add someone similar that they have to buy in. And so how they buy in and how much it is for them to buy in is a very involved question, because when you start a company, both an LLC and a corporation, its ownership is what's called par value, which means it's very, very low, like a thousandth of a cent. And the reason for that is that the company doesn't have any assets, it hasn't done anything yet, it doesn't have any value. And in addition to that, it creates a really easy tax burden for the initial owners. So like, let's say you have 50% of a company and you use that par value, your capital investment, your capital contribution for your 50% might be like a $5 contribution, and the taxes on that are very, very insignificant. Now, as time goes on though, our government, like I mentioned earlier, makes money off of companies and all of us when we pay our taxes. And so as a company's life goes on, even if the company doesn't have a bunch of revenue, even if it doesn't have a bunch of assets, the IRS and the government are going to assign an increased value of the ownership to that company as a default, because it has existed longer and thus has a higher value. And so when you add someone later, the value of the ownership is going to be higher and they need to pay more for that ownership. And then very importantly, with an LLC, because it's a 100% fixed pie of 100% ownership, if you add a partner later and you were the original single owner with all 100%, you actually have to give up your ownership and transfer it to that new person. And then you may have a taxable event. You may pay capital gains tax because you technically sold your ownership to that new person. Whereas with a corporation, that might not necessarily be the case, because with corporations, you can have authorized but unissued shares, meaning that there are shares that are available that no one owns yet, so no one has to sell them to the new person. You can just give them to the new person. But again, the value of those would be higher over time. So again, a very lawyerly long answer, but yes, you can certainly add a partner later. You just need to pay attention to what the taxes look like for that.
If you have an LLC and decide to become an LLC C Corp, do you need to have a board of directors meeting, etc.?
No, good question. So that's that whole sprinkles on the ice cream. Just because you do the S Corp, it doesn't turn your LLC into a corporation as far as the structure and the state legal requirements, like your board meetings and your shareholder meetings. It just changes the tax status to be that of a C Corp. So nope, LLC, still the same structure, no boards, no shareholder meetings, none of that, just a different tax status.
Oh, and the next one's so sweet. Hi, Sam and Olivia. This has been so helpful. My question is, how are you both so awesome? Thank you for all the great info. Any way we can keep in contact with you. I'll drop into the chat a couple different resources. We have our website, which has our blog. We update that. That's got good stuff for you. I'll drop our Instagram link. We post a lot of things kind of in real time to Instagram. So that's a great way to get info, and then also to just see what we're doing and hang out with us. And then I'll drop the link to our newsletter sign up if you'd like to sign up for that. We send those out about once a month, and they've got information kind of similar to Instagram. It's just a more condensed version of kind of the big things that have happened in a month or that you need to be aware of. So yeah, thanks. That was such a nice question. I'll drop that in the chat in just a sec. I'm interested in independent film production, but have little business/legal experience. I know that most films are created via an LLC. Can you give your thoughts on an LLC for an independent film?
Yeah, I think it's a good option to put it into the LLC. And most of our clients that create films, and we actually provide a lot of services for documentary filmmakers and just filmmakers in general. So, for instance, one of the things is what we call fair use screening, where we screen a film, we look at what types of risk there is there, and we assert fair use defenses for things that you might not have had permission to use in your film. And with that, you then go get errors and omissions insurance. And all of that is designed to protect you from liability if there's something in your film that someone sues over. There's a ton of different things that could cause that. If you use a news story in the news channel, things you didn't have permission, they try to sue. If you show someone's face in it and you didn't have permission, or their appearance release, even if you show a location that you didn't have permission to show. And so what having it in an LLC does is protects you personally if that lawsuit happens and if you lose it, which this is all worst case scenario. but having it in an LLC allows you to have that personal liability protection for something that can be pretty risky depending on the type of film.
All right. The last comment that we have currently says, "This workshop is amazing. Thank you." Well, we're happy to be here. Sam has answered most of these questions. So big clap from me to Sam.
Well, and thanks everyone for attending too, you know, taking hour and a half out of your day to listen to some lawyers drone on about boring stuff. That's commendable.
So I just want to thank you both, Sam and Olivia, for your talk today on behalf of CalArts. We really appreciate it. Your willingness to share your expertise with us and your time. I'd also like to thank all of the CalArtians who have tuned in with us today. Just want to thank everybody for joining us, and that's all that we've got. So please take care.
I love the CalArtians terminology.
Yeah.
Thank you to all the CalArtians that tuned in.